The Claw of the Conciliator is Book 2 in Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun series. It is, by many people's reckoning, the most difficult book in the series to understand, and also the most important. So let's talk about it. I'll begin by just giving a general spoiler, not warning, but just concern statement for anybody who hasn't read the series before. We will be alluding to events that have occurred already in the Shadow of the Torturer, and also probably going over some basic plot elements here, and alluding to things that happen in Claw of the Conciliator as well. I'm not going to go out of my way to spoil things, but also if you're particularly sensitive to that, you have been warned. Although, as most Wolfe fans will tell you, this is a series that's very difficult to spoil. Your first time reading it and your second time reading it will be very, very different. And oftentimes Sarian who's our main character and our narrator, will tell you things ahead of time before they happen, in a sense spoiling his own story. So if you're sensitive to that, be aware of that, but for those who are not, we shall continue. Generally, what the Claw of the Conciliator is about is it follows Sarian shortly after the events of the first book. We get the impression that some time has passed after the riot at the Gate of Nessus. But Sarian is now traveling alone, only with a character that he picked up as a traveling partner at the end of Book 1, and that's the character of Jonas, who we learn quite a bit more about in this book. Sarian travels, practices his trade as a torturer / executioner at a local town, and then also finds that he himself is being hunted down by the character of Agia from Book 1, who's wanting revenge for the death of her brother. After being hunted down by her, he finds himself to have stumbled back in the group of Vodalus's followers once again, and encounters Vodalus in a new and, shall we say, quite eye-opening way than how he had interacted with him before. From his meeting with Vodalus, he's given a new mission and ends up finding his way into the palace of the Autarch, the House Absolute, as it is called. Finds himself in the middle of a very odd and mystical play being put on by the very performers that he encountered in Book 1, is reunited with them, and even has a chance encounter with the Autarch, or at least a man he believes is the Autarch, and maybe begins to encounter more directly some supernatural or alien beings as well. When the Book of the New Sun was first being written by Gene Wolfe, it was originally envisioned as a trilogy. And this book obviously was the middle of it, and that play that I alluded to earlier is written by one of the characters. His name is Dr. Talos, and this play that Dr. Talos wrote was written to be the dead center of this trilogy. Now, Wolfe ended up having to split up some of the books and adding some additional stuff. Now it is more at the beginning half of this 4-book series rather than in the middle of the trilogy, but you can still see this play as being the hinge point of the entire series. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but just to understand that this really is the center of the story, and Wolfe does a lot of things there. In many ways, this is the most difficult book of the series. Many people feel that not only because textually this is the most difficult. Wolfe reaches his most literary parts of the series, and also some of the more textually difficult parts. There are many times where you're not sure if something is meant to be taken literally or figuratively, if something is a dream or a vision, or if our characters are actually encountering these strange occurrences. And also that play that we alluded to a moment ago. This play of Dr. Talos is very dense. It's difficult. It's called Eschatology in Genesis. We'll cover it a little bit more in the looking in some of the faith themes in Claw of the Conciliator video that will be coming out soon. But this play, Eschatology in Genesis, is a retelling of a story from the ancient text known as the Book of the New Sun. And it is unclear whether Dr. Talos is drawing from some otherworld text that is also called what this series is titled, or whether he's actually drawing from some past version of a document of Sarian's life, and that's where much of the inspiration for this play comes from. We do know that it takes a lot from the Christian story, from Christian mythology, but also from Zoroastrianism and other world mythologies as well. All in all, many readers of this book will find this play especially difficult to grapple with. If you listen to many of the podcasts that exist on Book of the New Sun and Gene Wolfe, they will often devote multiple episodes to trying to understand this play on a deeper level, because it very clearly is a linchpin for understanding the entire series, and yet at the same time is incredibly dense and difficult to understand. This play, being the centerpiece of this book as a whole, makes this one of the more challenging books in the series to really get a good grasp on, and can make it difficult for many people to understand what's going on. Really, if you get to the play and find yourself utterly confused, the play sort of serves as what the poems do in Lord of the Rings. If you're reading through the book Lord of the Rings and you find yourself skipping over the poems and be like, what is this? The books might not be for you. You may prefer the movies, The Lord of the Rings, but what Tolkien is trying to do in those books specifically, if you find yourself just glossing over the poetry, then you might be really missing what he's actually doing there. And in many ways, Dr. Talos's play serves the same purpose for Book of the New Sun. If you find yourself just glossing over it, just trying to get through it, not to say that you can't enjoy the series or get a lot out of it, but in terms of actually understanding what Wolfe is working with, if it is uninteresting to you and completely baffling in every way, then either A, dig deeper, or feel free to move on, because that really does become a linchpin for the entire series. I want to make it clear, I'm by no means pretending to even understand a fraction of all of the depth that is contained in this one part of Claw of the Conciliator. I too am very confused by it, but just to say that it is a helpful litmus test as to whether or not you'll enjoy the rest of the series or not. But in other ways, this is also the most difficult book, because Sarian is, how to put this delicately, at his worst in this book. Not only do many of his worst parts of his personality come out, but many of the most inexcusable crimes of Sarian are committed in this book specifically. It may be very appropriate to put up a number of trigger warnings, both for sexual violence, actual violence, and other degrading things that I won't get into, mainly because of spoiler reasons, but needless to say, this book especially is not for the faint of heart, and most people who will be turned off to this book will probably already have dropped it by Shadow of the Torturer. Wolfe is never graphic or gratuitous, and yet, even in the mature way that he deals with many of the difficult subjects in Claw of the Conciliator, he still deals with them in a way that it comes across as very heavy and difficult for the reader, and very uncomfortable to read about, and rightly so. So that makes this one of the more difficult books in the series, simply because of how, to put it sheepishly, how badly Sarian behaves during this volume. But you do really get a much better grasp of who Sarian is as a character in this volume, even more so than you did in the first volume, The Shadow of the Torturer. Wolfe's characterization is really fascinating, because in many ways, it's almost the way that short story authors will do characterization. If you're used to reading typical fantasy, modern literature, stuff that's a little bit less dense, there's a certain way that you're trained to think what makes good characterization versus bad characterization. And most of that has to do with emotional attachment to a character, which is a very, very subjective metric for whether or not an author is good at writing characters or not. Wolfe does not write his characters in such a way that you'll often get warm, fuzzy feelings, or your heart will be broken or rent apart because of something that's happened to them. He writes in a way that, like I said, like a short story writer, implies a lot about character based on little things. Many of his characters can be very archetypal, and yet, based on little details that he will give or things that he will play with, you will gain a firm understanding of who these people are, how they think, how they operate, even if it's in just a sentence or two. Some of his most memorable characters are highlighted in this book. For example, the playwright, Dr. Talos, who, as we come to learn in this book, is actually an automaton or a robot of some kind, and Baldanders, the monstrous giant Nephilim creature, is actually the master over him. Instead of playing on the usual Frankenstein and his creator, you have the monster who has created the Doctor, And this will be explored more in the third book, The Sword of the Lictor, but that becomes a fascinating dynamic which you only learn about near the end of this book. And so that change in dynamic is something that you have that context to reinterpret what you've already read. And also that play, which was written by an automaton robotic being, and yet is filled with not only biblical depth, but also depth as far as this story is concerned. You also have the memorable character of Jonas, Severian's traveling partner for the first half of this volume. Jonas, as we come to learn, is he calls himself a sailor, but these ships that he is sailing are spaceships. He's a sailor, and yet he's a bionicle man who's being mended with biological parts. So instead of what you'd usually see in science fiction with, say, a Luke or Anakin type figure, where they're men, but they're mended with robotic parts, the hands and limbs that are chopped off. With Jonas, we have an inversion of that. He's a robotic, bionicle man of some kind that has been mended with human parts, giving him the appearance of being a normal man. So much so that Sarian, even though he's a little dense to begin with many of these matters, doesn't even realize fully who Jonas is until later on in this story. And of course, one of the most memorable characters in this book is the character of Jolenta. Jolenta, who we learn is the tavern maid that we met in the first book, that in a sense makes a deal with the devil, makes a deal with Dr. Talos, who we come to see as being a very corrupt and twisted figure, to make herself incredibly beautiful. So beautiful that whether it's by pure desire because of her appearance or some sort of alchemy or spell, all men have an incredible, ravenous desire for her, and according to Jolenta, many women as well. And yet we see that this ends up destroying her. Though Jolenta's desire is to become the best performer and to be desired by all, and even to seduce the autarch, which we end up learning in hindsight is exactly what she does, because she does, Sarian does fall under her spell of desire, if you will. Although he's entirely at fault for what happens, he does fall for her, and she ends up seducing the autarch, although it ends up being much worse for her than if she had just remained a tavern maid. It reminds me of that quote, and I can't ever remember whether it's from C.S. Lewis or somebody like Jordan Peterson, but that everybody eventually gets what they want. They just don't always like it. And that really is a good summation of the character of Jolenta in this story. One way that she's been described that really helped me understand her better is that she's very much a Marilyn Monroe type character. She's very glamorous, she has this stage presence, and yet there's a real depth to her character beneath that sexy facade, that sexy show that she puts on. And that show of desire that she puts on ends up destroying her. Even though she's made a deal with the devil, as always, the devil gets the better end of that. And then if we're speaking of characters in this book, we of course have to speak about our main boy, Sarian. He's our main character and our narrator, the one who's writing, allegedly who's writing this account that we are reading. And Sarian takes some very interesting turns as far as the role that he'll play in the story going forward in this book. We learn a lot more about what is his actual connection to this mythical, messianic figure of the Conciliator. What is his role to the ancient king, Apu Panchao, which we get into a little bit at the end of the book. And these parts not only make his character more mystical, and to me at least as a reader, it's confusing. It's difficult to understand all of what Wolfe is trying to imply about who he is. But then also, there's this question of Sarian as a reliable or unreliable narrator. With the rise of first-person narratives being very popular in fiction these days, there really is this question frequently about how much can you trust a narrator in a first-person story. And that really is a postmodern question, and Wolfe clearly plays with it because Sarian does contradict himself at times. There are times where it really seems like he omits things, and yet there are some people who would assert that Sarian's making all of this up. All of this is bluff, blunder. This is one big book of literary propaganda that Wolfe put together, all put in the guise of Sarian recounting it. And I really can't find a way for that interpretation to make sense. I tend to be a lot more charitable towards Sarian as a narrator and think that, to quote a line actually from Dr. Talos in Book 1, that he lies less often than people think. And a part of why I believe that is because Sarian's pretty unflinching with showing just how difficult of a character he is in this book. We see him execute people unjustly. We see him engage in the act of cannibalism. We see him sexually assault or even rape a woman in this book. And even though he doesn't describe everything in gory detail, very thankfully he does not, even though he doesn't glorify those moments or spend a lot of time on them, and it can seem that he brushes past them rather quickly, he still includes them in the story. The fictional character writing this fictional account still chooses to put those items there. If he were completely lying, if this were all one big act of propaganda to glorify himself, I can't help but think that many of these most difficult and disgusting elements about who his character is at this point in the story would have been omitted. Sarian's stubbornness to record who he is, warts and all, faults and all, problems and all, I think to me lend credence to the credibility of this fictional account. As far as that question of is he telling the truth, is he not, I think these things really add a lot of credibility to that. But also, Sarian dramatically changes in this book. Once again, trying to keep it rather spoiler light, Sarian ends up adopting a second consciousness into his mind through this book. And maybe that's, Wolfe experts will really say that's a bad way of saying it, but basically there's almost like a second voice that comes into his head, a second personality. And it is not like he's having a split personality, it is a distinctly other, almost soul, if you will, that enters his mind, that enters his heart in this book, that ends up affecting how he thinks about things. And you will notice a drastic change in his character after that happens. It changes how he perceives the world. He has new memories. He has a new understanding of different parts of society because of this. And so Wolfe asks this question: how much does memory define you? How much can you change of your soul before you're a completely different person? Does this change who you are as far as your morality, and even how much does it change your values? Some of the most evil things that Sarian does in the story of Book of the New Sun occur after this change. And so there's an argument to be made that old Sarian, single consciousness Sarian, despite the crimes that he's committed, would not have engaged in some of the more evil things that happened to him in Claw the Conciliator. And once again, for many people, they'll find this deeply uncomfortable because Sarian takes on a messianic role more and more as the series goes on. It's very uncomfortable to see your pseudo-Christ-like figure being a murderer, being an adulterer, a rapist, if you will. That is very uncomfortable, and so it should be. And I think Wolfe intends it for it to be that way. As he says, he's a bad man trying to become good. And so in this world of evil, even the messianic figure becomes, in the world that is upside down, you have an inverted Messiah figure as well. This isn't to say that we should like Sarian as a character, although I do have a lot of empathy for him, and I want to see where his story goes, and I'm very fascinated by him. I don't approve of what he does, nor do I think any normal reader will. When I first read the Book of the New Sun, I found the odd-numbered books, so Book 1 and 3, to be easier to understand, to be the ones that I engaged with more, and the even-numbered books 2 and 4 to be more difficult, more challenging. I still think that's probably the case, although it's been interesting to see my perspective change on this reread. When I first read Claw the Conciliator, I only gave it 4 stars on Goodreads because of many of those challenging things that I felt like held it back from being as high of a read, at least for me. Now, once again, that's on me as the reader, definitely not on Gene Wolfe as a writer. That says nothing about his skill per se. But on a reread, once again, as with The Shadow of the Torturer, rereading this book completely changes your perspective. Once you've gotten all the way through all 4 books of the Book of the New Sun and Earth of the New Sun, your perspective on the story changes, and it's like reading a completely different story in many, many ways. I definitely enjoyed this more the second time. I think I got a lot more out of it the second time. I think I understood more of what Wolfe was trying to do in this story. I'll say the ending is still difficult to understand, and it's still challenging. And really the ending of all 4 volumes of Book of the New Sun is challenging and difficult to understand. But I'm definitely excited to see how my perspective changes going into Book 3, going into The Sword of the Lictor. But I think Claw the Conciliator emphasizes more of the themes that Wolfe is playing at. If you found Shadow the Torturer to be slower or to be more difficult to follow or understand, I'm not going to say that Claw the Conciliator will be easier, but maybe more of what you're looking for is in here. I think there's more depth to be found in Book 2, more themes to be drawn out, and some more fascinating questions that are asked. Anyway, guys, that video on dealing with issues of faith and Christian Catholic symbolism in Book of the New Sun and in this volume will be coming out shortly. So if you're interested in that, feel free to drop a follow. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think of Book of the New Sun. What parts of analyzing it I can improve on. I'm a pretty amateur Wolfe reader, though I greatly enjoy his work, so feel free to leave any advice or comments that you may have. And until next time, I hope you all have a good afternoon. If it is afternoon when you're watching this.